go. Okay, Marie, do you want to share the slides? Thank you very much. So again, big welcome to everyone. Lots to share today. So let's come to the first slide, please, Marie. So recap, this is about where we're at with the landscape review, coming towards the end of our alpha phase. Really busy time, lots of sessions with services and organizations over the next week or so. But we're also really starting to crunch the data we gathered so far. So we've got some early thoughts that we can share today. Our current plan is that this phase completes by December 10th. Then we'll publish out a full summary shortly afterwards of what we've learned in this phase. We'll then have a small pause while we share and discuss the findings in and outside the CDPS before resuming activities early in the new year. Quick recap of our goal on the left-hand side there. The heart of this is taking a broad view across public services in Wales to help CDPS understand how we can make sure we're building our plans and delivering them in the most effective way possible. Snapshot of the team on the right. You'll be hearing from me, Rick Stock, but also from my teammates, Henry and Marie, very shortly. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. These are the things we should have by December the 10th. As we said, we'll be finding a summary overview of those shortly before Christmas. And to move on to the next slide. This shows you who we've spoken to date. It's an ever-growing list. And of course, we have to say a big thank you to each and every one of those people who spent the time talking to us. We know everyone is super busy, and that time is the most valuable thing that people can share at the moment. So we really do appreciate that. If we can move on to the next slide. This is a picture of our target numbers with how we've done against those. You can see making some really good numbers there now. A couple of lower numbers on the right-hand side there around school services and health and care. We've got some things in the diary through this week. And if we have to, we can revisit some areas in the next phase. And I think we're particularly thinking that perhaps with health, we may well do that. Now, over to Henry and Marie, who are going to give us some very early insights based on what we've heard so far over the last couple of months.
Thank you, Rick. So today we're going to be particularly focusing on the initial data that we've got in our service survey. So just as a recap, near the beginning of the review, we developed a survey to send to service owners to understand both how service owners think about their services, the process they went through to design and build their services, and then how they deliver and run them. As of yesterday afternoon, we had 92 responses, but we've had another 5 services that we've met with this morning, and we expect to have maybe another 10 to 15 over the next week as we come to the end of the phase. This slide just gives an overview of who has responded to the survey, and you can see that there is quite equal and quite good coverage across local authorities, sponsored bodies and Welsh Government services, and then a small number of voluntary sector, health and care and UK government services. Particularly in health and care, we are expecting to again get about another 10 hopefully from today and over the next week, which should give us better coverage kind of across those 4 areas we've looked at. Just to explain the UK government, which maybe looks a bit unusual given our scope focusing on Welsh Public Services, that was 2 services where the Welsh government signposts that service and provides some information about what it is for Welsh users, but actually the platform that forms the kind of bulk of how that service supports people is delivered by a part of the UK government. And actually the 2 examples there is the Space Cymru platform, looking at public sector property in Wales, and the NHS COVID Pass platform, which are both run by different parts of UK government. Should we go on to the next slide? Then if we just look at across those 90 services, what types of people are they actually helping? So, what kind of person is using these services? We see that the large majority, so about 70 of those services are supporting a member of the public. An example there might be residents living in Blaenau Gwent, but sometimes they're more specific. So it might be business owners who work in a particular sector, for example. We then we've had about 10 services that support frontline public servants. So that might be a clinician or it might be a teacher, for example. and then about 10 services which support internal civil servants or local government officers, so people who work in the Welsh Government or other local authorities. We have said from the offset that all of these different groups are in scope for the review, but that we have had a bit more of a focus on members of the public, which I think is reflected there in the responses that we've had. Should we go on to the next slide? This is then just an initial question of just understanding where the survey responses we've had sit on that kind of spectrum of fully digital, partially digital, non-digital services. So the question was, can the end-to-end user journey be completed digitally? So that's thinking about, can the person who's using this service go online and use some kind of website or digital platform to get to the goal that they're trying to achieve? An example of a service which answered yes to this is, for example, a service giving information on whether the public sector property is available to buy or let, and that person can go online and fully answer that question or that need. We did meet with a number of services where the service cannot be completed entirely digitally, and often that's those services where you might expect there to be some kind of face-to-face interaction, or where you might expect there to be a telephone call. For example, here a user need of young people who are experiencing challenges with their mental health and well-being, where there's a service providing them that support. One interesting thing I think that we've heard through the review is about how some of these services, which have traditionally been delivered through face-to-face or through a telephone conversation, have potentially had to shift that way of working during the COVID pandemic over the last 2 years. And they've had to move to things like video conferencing or using Teams. And now they're thinking about, do they go back to that kind of old normal, or do they now think about doing a hybrid approach going forwards, where some people are continuing to use that digital service? So it's not always that there's exactly a black and white answer to this question. Can we go on to the next slide? The next question then is, have you heard of the digital service standards, which are the standards published by the Centre for Digital Public Services, giving some things to think about in delivering an effective and user-centered service. You can see here that, so we've had about 70 responses to this question, or 75 responses to this question. That's not because 20 people decided not to respond. This is actually a question that we added in as a direct question a little bit into the review. So those first 20 respondees weren't asked this one. If we look at the roughly 75 who have answered this, we see that actually it's about 50-50 between services that have heard of the standards and are working or have already believe they meet those standards, and then about 50% of services that either haven't heard of those standards or have not yet considered whether the service meets them. And we think that's quite an interesting finding from the review. We think these digital service standards are quite an important way in which we can let people know what good looks like and support people in delivering really great user-centered services. But we think there's probably more that we could do to explain how a service really applies these and can have confidence that their service is meeting them. So that's something we're thinking about. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Oh, and then I'm over to Marie at this point.
Thanks, Henry. Another question we asked in our service survey was about whether the service had a service owner, which we defined as the individual responsible for the quality of the service. So we found that most of the services, so 87%, were able to identify a service owner, but we were interested in the range of roles and of levels of responsibility that we got in the job titles of those service owners. So, for example, we found that for about 20% of services, the service owner was identified at a very senior organizational level. An example of a service is mental health support for young adults, where the CEO of the charity was named as the service owner. The majority of services named someone kind of department or division level, and that, for example, could be for the service of reporting a missed bin collection, identifying the head of waste recycling as the service owner. And lastly, we had about 20% where the identified service owner was at service level specifically, and that, for example, could be a service for taking payments in Welsh Government, identifying the project manager for that project as the service owner. So we think it's helpful to have a kind of empowered individual at that service level who has an overview of the service and is responsible for the quality and for improving it. And the range of responses that we got suggests that that's not the case in every service, and that suggests an opportunity for CDPS to come in and work with services on that. We also asked services questions about how many users use their services. We found that a bit over 1/3 were able to provide that data. The majority did not, for a number of reasons, one of them being that that data didn't exist or wasn't accessible by the service team. But sometimes, even if it did exist, it would have taken a large amount of work to compile, and in which case we decided not to ask services to do that. But these numbers suggest then that for a majority of services, that user number isn't something that they have to hand or that they track closely. For the numbers that we did get, the average digital uptake was about 62%, but we should note that for over 1/3, digital uptake was reported as 100%, which again then suggests that these are metrics which could be tracked more closely. We also asked the services about accessibility. So we asked whether they met the International Accessibility Standard, WCAG 2.1AA, which is a standard which digital services should meet to ensure that they can be used by as many people as possible. And that includes people with impaired vision or impaired hearing, cognitive impairments, or learning disabilities, for example. So we found that about 40% of services reported that they knew that they met the International Accessibility Standard, and a similar number had published an accessibility statement. But the majority didn't know, and a small but not insignificant number did not meet the standard and had not published an accessibility statement. Again, this suggests an area where CDPS could come and support specific services to work on their accessibility and gain confidence that they are meeting that standard. Separately, we also heard in our interviews concerns about digital inclusion. So particularly around COVID, with services having to be put online very quickly and not having the time to give enough consideration to issues of digital inclusion, which meant that some users, mostly for socioeconomic factors, were left behind. So that's something that CDPS is keen to work on and bring user-centered service design to ensure that services really understand the needs of their users and make sure that services are accessible by all of their user base, even if that means that some channels should be non-digital. So we definitely don't have all the answers right now, but this is something that we heard from services as a priority and that they're keen to work on. So that suggests, again, an opportunity to work with services on digital inclusion to find a solution. I'm now going to pass over to Henry to talk about service cost data.
Thanks, Marie. So quite a similar takeaway then on cost data as with user numbers data. Again, we found that 31 out of the 92 responses have provided some data on costs. Again, I think that for that group that did not provide any data, for that group that did not provide any data on costs, that doesn't necessarily mean that that data doesn't exist in the organization. I think for many, it showed that organizations internally are not necessarily structuring their activities in an end-to-end service way. Instead, they might have functional teams which are delivering kind of parts of multiple services. So their kind of internal finances isn't set up in a way that they could answer at the service level. Other organizations suggested that they could provide this, but again, it would take a lot of time, or even running a mini investigation to work out how much those costs were. And in that case, we didn't suggest that they should spend more than a few hours with their team to get that data. Can we go on, Marie? So then if we look at the data, if we look at those services that were able to provide cost data, so we had 31 services that were able to provide some cost data. We actually asked for capital costs and running costs. Of those 31, 29 of those services were able to provide cost data on their annual running costs for their service. We found that those costs were really variable in those 29. So what we've done here is show a histogram, which just shows how many of those services fall into a particular range of costs. So if we look on the far left, we see that 13 services reported an annual running cost of between £2,000 and £102,000. Whereas over on the far right, we had 6 services reporting annual running costs of more than £500,000. And actually with the highest spending service spending £6 million per year, which is an order of magnitude more, or a couple of order of magnitudes more than some of the other services in the sample. We think this is quite interesting in just seeing the range of how much different services cost to run. But actually a big thing that this shows is just that within our database, or within the range of services delivered across Wales, there is a great deal of variation in the kind of complexity or scale of those services. So over on the left, some of the things we see here might be a particular service run by a particular local authority that's meeting quite a specialized need just for their local area. Whereas over in this far right group, we might have services where you have a central digital platform running for all, running a particular function for all organisations across Wales. Shall we just let Glyn in? I've just seen Sam Hall's comment. I think he's in the lobby. Great. So then, Marie, could we go on to the next slide? We then had a couple of questions, understanding kind of which types of staff or which types of organisation are involved in designing and then running services. So first thinking about that kind of designing or building phase of a service, where we're thinking about how can we best meet this user need. We asked about whether internal staff or a couple of different types of external staff were involved. We found that for almost all services, internal staff to that organisation are involved in the design or build of the service. There is about 6% were entirely run by an external team, which might be, for example, contracting out that design to another team. Then in terms of involving external staff, it was about 50% of the people of the services that responded to us involved some type of external staff. That might have meant individual contractors, so where you brought in an independent software developer to help with that service, or it might mean where you've contracted out to a whole team provided by an external organisation. Should we go on to the next slide? This is then looking at, once the service is up and running, how is the service delivered? Is it delivered internally or is it contracted out? And we found that about 2/3 of services are run entirely by internal teams once they're up and running. And then of the remainder, 27% were partially contracted to a private sector company. So that would be a business that is running a part of the service, often with the support of maybe a contract manager in the organisation. So it's rarely entirely run by the private sector organisation. And then 7% of services were actually run by another public service organisation, which might include a charity. Can we go on to the next slide? This is then the final slide about the service survey. And this is just looking at the presence of digital data and technology roles in service teams in both that design and delivery phase. You can see that the darker green is the percentage of services which had that particular role in the team while they were designing the service. And then that lighter green is the percentage of services that had that role in the team once the service was up and running and they're actually delivering it. You'll see that for each of the roles, there's generally more of a presence of these kind of digital data and technology roles during design than in delivery, which I think reflects that broadly, while services are thinking about improvement and they are doing iterative design in some ways, they don't necessarily maintain these large teams and think about iteration in a bigger way. It tends to be more the case that services have a distinct design phase, and then once they're up and running, it's only smaller changes made If we then look at the actual individual roles, we see that service owners are the most present, which is similar to that conclusion at the beginning. Delivery managers, developers, and designers were then the next most present. Meanwhile, roles like business analysts and user researchers actually had relatively low presence in the services that we spoke to. And in particular, user researchers we found had a very small involvement after services were up and running. I think that presence of iterative user research and really understanding how people are finding the service is something we're quite interested in. So that's something that we're potentially keen to look at in the future, that we're mindful that different organizations have different operating models. So there's not always going to be one size that fits all for all services. With that, I think I'm passing on to Rick to talk about some of the other activities that we've been working on.
Thank you, Henry. So there is obviously some really interesting insights we're starting to glean from the conversations we've had with particular services and the ones we've talked to directly. But there's also a whole load of other services that we're gathering data on. And you can see there's nearly 500 that we've got some kind of view on across Wales. To note, I guess, we're taking a slightly different approach there in the data gathering of local authorities. There, we're starting with a generic list of services and we're seeing which ones they provide and whether we need to augment or kind of highlight that they don't provide particular parts of that list, but really kind of get a specific view of 280 and more than 280 kind of services that we've heard from directly from organisations across Wales. So we then are looking to group those either by the similarity of their high-level design patterns or by the kind of components that are suggested that they may be able to use. And that we're then going to use to potentially suggest services and products and services for CDPS to deliver going forward. I think if we can move on to the next slide. We've started this process already, and I think we've had some really good kind of learning on that as we've gone along. We shared a bit of this list last time. It's actually a slightly different list. We've iterated the list, and then we have a slightly different list that we're now kind of mapping the services against. And we've really been able to refine and expand that as we go through the process of actually trying to categorize the services. If we can move on to the next slide, there's an example of randomly chosen from that very long list of a service from the National Library of Wales there, which shows how that kind of groups against those kind of criteria we had on the previous slide. So we should stress that what we're looking for is sometimes that is not necessarily how the service works now, that's how the service could work against those particular areas. And we should also stress that this is very much kind of we're part way through this, and we'll look to share some more findings from this area of the study when we talk next time. If we can go on now to this slide here, another kind of thing that we're using to help us kind of zero in on what products and services CDPS could offer. We're running a series of structured workshop sessions where we run through some early thinking around what the products and service offering might be. And we have the questions, the big questions down the left-hand side there that we're hoping will help us refine that list, suggest particular emphasis on particular areas to get us to that goal of a costed roadmap at the end of our study. So 3 sessions so far, next one coming up this Friday with our CDPS advisory group. Got some really fantastic responses, been very valuable hearing views on that so far, so really looking forward to that final session there. If we can move on to the next slide here, quick recap of next steps. Really getting to the end of our focus groups and technology interviews now, but they are getting, as we've seen, just a kind of small snapshot of the things we've heard so far, really starting to get some interesting information based on what we've seen there. We then take all of this together. We've got a huge amount of data still to crunch to generate the final outputs, the review. We'll share some initial work kind of shortly with the incoming CEOs, Harriet and Myra, and then we'll also play back to our stakeholders, including Glyn and Sam, who are on the call. We also will look then to be confirming plans for what we do next. And so we've had some initial conversations within CDPS about particular areas of focus that we could then go further into, or perhaps some areas where we might want to broaden out and get a wider sample of information. Finally, our next show and tell, 7th of December, and a reminder, as always, onto the next slide, of how you can get involved we're always there at that email address. Very happy to hear any input, perhaps based on what you've heard here, or suggestions on the conversations we've had with people across Wales so far. Do put us in contact with your tech leads if we're talking to you already, and we would encourage your teams, again, similarly, to join our focus groups. The quite a small number that we have left to run now, but we really appreciate everyone's time so far on that. And a reminder that previous show and tells, we now have a slightly shorter URL on our last slide there, that you can see our previous show and tells on the CDPS YouTube channel. That's the end of our show and tell. I think there's a couple of questions that we've got in the sidebar here. Let's pick that up. Glenn, do you want to come back on that one? I think Henry's come back with an answer, but anything you want to pick up in there particularly?
No, I think Henry answered the question. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not expecting that that all the services have got people doing those roles. It just strikes me that we suspect that DDAT roles are not widely used in the public sector. So I expect that that question is probably leading us to certain people, but not the rest. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me because my connection's got a bit.
No, that we had that loud and clear. Thank you. Anybody else like to come in with a question there?
Yeah, hi there, Rick. Ivan Evans here from Welsh Government. I'm just, so there's a lot of information here. I missed the beginning of the presentations, unfortunately, but I saw from a separate chat with Sam that there's some really good stuff there, so I'll review that later on. What's the sort of timetable of the roadmap for using this information, making some decisions off the back of it? Sort of remind me, at what point are we taking what we're gathering from the landscape review and then turning that into some sort of informed decision-making, prioritization, or target activities, or whatever else it is that we're going to do?
Sure. So the timetable for producing the initial costed roadmap as a suggestion back to CDPS is December the 10th. And then I think almost certainly that will go into conversation within CDPS, and obviously with the new CEOs coming in as well, I'm sure that they want to have a view on that as well. So it's a little difficult to comment on that, it's precisely to give you a date. But I think probably the best way of that is if we kind of we'll put that question to Anne and Sally, and perhaps if they can come back to you on that. But I think probably to highlight that there are things that we're finding already which are suggesting join ups with some of the work they're doing. We're already doing. So, for example, just this week we're putting some of the team who are working with Sport Wales in touch with some of the people who are working at grant funding from some of the organisations we've met as we've been going through the landscape review. So it's already providing a value to an extent. Anybody else want to come in with a question?
Hi, Rick. It's Ellen here from Powys. Yeah, just a question. Apologies, but I'm not quite aware of the full scope of this. So you might have kind of covered this, and I'm sure it's in the information. But thinking about some of the information you provided, which is great. There's some really good information there, and it's nice to have that view. I suppose what's going on in my head is what is good and what's bad. So we've got the principles, we've got the digital standards, we've got the guidance around that. But in terms of some of the questions like, the ownerships of projects, of kind of services, where it sits, is there going to be a piece of work around where it should actually sit? So we've got the information about the landscape of what it looks like, but then some good practice guidance about, okay, well, what works well and what kind of doesn't?
Yeah, so I think the interventions from the CDPS generally come within the frame of the the overall digital service standard. So, but I think one of the things that we're trying to highlight is, are there specific areas where we think CDPS, working with obviously with colleagues across the public services, can come in and really focus in on particular areas. And I think service owner was one we picked up earlier. There are others, user research, actually how aware people are of the service standards, another one. So I think that really helps us form that roadmap of kind of interventions, and that's what goes into there. So that really is the answer to, you know, what happens next. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Can I might just add something to that, which is that there's probably some things where it's more straightforward to, where there might be more kind of one standard piece of guidance that works for many services and many organizations. And that's where you might look to add some more detail to those service standards on kind of, you know, how you get to a point of your service meeting them. I think there are other areas where we do recognize that maybe DDAT roles is a good example. It's not as simple as saying that, you know, all services should have the same exact team structure, and that works for all organizations or all service areas. And I think anything where there's a finding or a recommendation in that kind of area, we want to do more work to go out and actually understand what it means for different organizations. And we'd want to do that next level of detail before we not just publish one thing that we're suggesting works for all.
Probably one more thing that I should have highlighted when Evan asked this question was, obviously we are talking to you very shortly, Evan, and we would welcome your feedback, I guess, once we've got those initial kind of roadmap findings and suggestions there. Anyone else want to come in with a question there? Okay. I think we're about there. So many thanks for all the questions. Many thanks for everyone spending their time coming here and hearing some of the initial things we've got to say. There is much more to come. We should stress that. And we look forward to hopefully talking to you again in 2 weeks' time. Many thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.